Okay, ready? We're recording. Welcome to our empathy circle of empathy activists and empathy experts. I had to use that word experts. It sounds a little too much, maybe, but I'll use it anyway. So this is a group of people who have worked extensively on the topic of empathy, and we'll start with quick introductions, very short introductions, name what your work is on empathy and any contact info. I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and for about 12 years I've been working on the topic of empathy, doing interviews and just all kinds of different projects to build a more empathic society and culture. Mark, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, and I'm a lecturer here at the University of Central Florida. I teach philosophy classes here, and I'm writing a book on empathy, on my theory of empathy called relational empathy, which tries to combine a bunch of different definitions from the last 200 years to create a more practical effect, I guess, the way we think about empathy. And I'm also the founder of Empathy Vision and Empathy Activation, which are two organizations I founded, which have similar goals and missions as your organization.
Is there a website or some way to...
www.empathyvision.com. Right now we're doing a lot of training and safety training and empathy training for hospitals and construction sites, mostly in the hospital end. But things just kind of roll into other industries because it seems like this is pretty important everywhere.
Yeah.
So.
And you also, I've seen online, you have some trainings too on YouTube, some empathy trainings. So, yep. Lou?
So I'm Lou Zwier. I am an educator and filmmaker. I do trainings in communication skills and leadership and conflict resolution. I'm doing a public listening project called Petaluma Conversations here in Petaluma, and I've worked with Edwin doing cross-political dialogue work with the Empathy Tent for about a year. And I'm also one of the partners in a group in Sacramento called the Authentic Leadership Center, and we do transformational training there that includes a communication model that has empathic listening in it.
Any way to contact you?
lou.zwire@gmail.com.
Yeah, and we were just together at the California Democratic Party convention. We had signs advocating for empathy, had our empathy t-shirts, and we're really trying to get empathy into working to get with our team, get empathy into politics. So what our topic is today is sort of self-referential about the empathy circle itself. So our topic is, what is your experience of taking part in an empathy circle? We're just going to talk about our experience, and what feelings come up, what you like, what you don't like, what you wish for, what it feels like in the moment, just anything that comes up about the empathy circle itself. So the empathy circle, to give an introduction, is a structured dialogue process based on mutual active listening. So the process increases constructive dialogue and mutual understanding by supporting each person in feeling heard and heard to their satisfaction. And the basic, everyone here knows how to take part in it, but I'll just give a really quick introduction. In this process, one person will speak and they'll select who they're going to speak to. And you can speak about, whatever comes up on the topic or whatever is alive for you. And the listener will reflect or sort of recap their understanding of what the speaker has said. And we're going to have, I guess, maybe start with 5-minute turns and extend it to 10-minute turns. And then if you feel like you've said a little bit, you don't have anything else to say, you can say, I feel fully heard, and that just indicates it's the listener's turn to become the speaker, and then the new speaker selects who they're going to speak to and speaks on the topic, and the listener reflects back. We go for the time allotted, which was 2 hours. We'll see if we use the whole time. And a couple of tips. As is the speaker, you want to pause periodically to give the listener a chance to recap or reflect what they're hearing. And as a speaker, as a listener, you can also, if it's becoming too much, you're kind of getting lost in what the speaker is saying, you can say, oh, can you pause? And then you can, for a chance to just reflect back just what you're hearing the speaker say. So anything else, Lou, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a good explanation.
Okay, great. So let's get started. What's your experience with taking part in the empathy? Oh, and time. Let me get stopwatch. Bring up the time. So yeah, whoever would like to start, and I'll do the timekeeping.
Lou, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So, so my experience of being in...
Who are you speaking to?
Oh, thanks. So I'll speak to Mark. So my experience of being in an empathy circle, let me think. So one, I think first, it's just inspiring to me, feels very good when people get together and are willing to sit with each other and listen to each other, and watching people do that, taking the time to do that and really wanting to understand each other and even struggle through whatever difficulty they may have in actually, reflecting back what people are saying, because many people are not used to doing that. That's inspiring to me to see that happen, and it gives me hope, that if people listen to each other more, that we'll have more understanding in the world and a more connected world.
So getting together and in these circles are all positive experience for you. One of the ways this is structured, I'm wondering, is there any, like, if there's a point of clarification, is that something that's brought in as a question?
I would say that if a question pops up for you, that you can say that when it's your turn to speak. But in this part where you're just listening, then it's just reflecting back what you were hearing me say.
Yeah.
So what you're understanding about what I'm saying.
Right. It seems like you find it really beneficial, and it's making to bring people together and have that connection, which is so missing in the world, globally, and then even with neighbors, when that sort of connection, because people aren't listening to each other. Is that right?
Yeah, and that it's inspiring to me. It kind of moves me whenever I'm in a circle. And then I would say a second thing that I experienced that's pretty significant is that when I talk about something, I share about something that's real for me, and another person reflects back what they're hearing me say, and the reflection shows that they're really understanding what I'm saying. I feel seen, and I feel cared for in a way that that's very sweet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So being heard, in addition to the connection, actually being heard, not only is inspirational, probably, but it's something that you feel cared for. So you can have that bodily feeling of being cared for because someone's listening.
Yes, yeah, and when I witness others caring for each other in that way, because I do see it as an act of caring, to really pay attention to what someone's saying and to try to feed it back to them so that they know that they're understood. Those acts of caring give me a lot of hope and inspiration too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, the caring brings about a lot of hope and inspiration, because it seems it would continue on then from that. It builds sort of a foundation for further care, further communication.
Yeah. The other thing that comes up for me strongly is just about the structure of the circle. So I've taught communication and conflict resolution skills for a very long time. And one of the things, and so there are some aspects of the empathy circle process, the structure of it, that supports people in hearing each other in ways that are are very useful and practical and powerful. And so I'd like to say a little something more about that, about how the structural elements of the circle, how they work. That's something that I notice about it too.
And those structural elements are important then to the actual consequence of what's going to come out of conflict resolution or the listening skills when they're applied.
Yeah, and it's more that these structural elements of the circle, promote actually good listening, and they promote learning good listening, and they do it in a way that's very effective compared to other things that I've taught before.
Right. So you find it very, very effective.
Yeah. So the structural elements that I find make a big difference are timed turn taking, so that there's kind of enforced mutuality in the circle. Nobody dominates the conversation because the turns are timed and there's mutuality in it. Did I hear a time signal?
No, I'm sorry. That was
okay.
I was just thinking, I was going to let go of the time. So we could so we can fully express ourselves, like 10 minutes, let's say, to extend it.
Okay. Well, I'm also happy to do shorter amounts. We can come back around to the things I'm saying. So there's that piece. Do you want to reflect that back before I don't want to give you a whole bunch of pieces?
Yes, I'm sorry. You're talking about that again in the structure. You repeat that?
Yeah. So I was saying that the time turn taking, and how that enforces mutuality in the speaking in the circle. I think that's a really healthy structural element.
So that no one dominates it, which is so often the case. This time taking the structure allows for everyone to be heard without anybody completely dominating the conversation.
Yes.
Disallow anyone else to speak or be heard.
Yeah, and then another element is that the listener, so you have someone who's the speaker, and they select someone in the circle to reflect back what they're hearing. And then at the end of the turn, the speaker's turn, the listener becomes the speaker. So that piece of structural element, there's a couple things that does. So one, it distributes the speaking and listening around the circle, because the person has to pick a different person each time. And the second is that because the listener has to listen to reflect back, they're not sitting there thinking about their judgments and what they want to say and all that. They're outside of that. They have to be outside of that in order to reflect back. And so when it comes time for them to speak, they haven't been sitting there building up lots of stuff that they want to, immediately jump into. And I think that causes a little bit more of a reflective stance when people start speaking.
So another structural element is that part when the listener then becomes the speaker, and there's different dynamics between different people when they address different folks, and different things arise, different variations arise, and people feel heard. And this is another structural element. So I think 2 or 3.
Yeah, and a part that you didn't quite reflect back is that because right before you become the speaker, you're the listener, you are paying attention to what another person is saying, and you're really focused on that. So you're not sitting there focused on all of your judgments and the ways you want to respond and the arguments you want to make. And then when it's your turn to speak, you're coming in with that. You kind of have to come in blank because you've been listening right before you started speaking. And I think that creates a more reflective stance when people start speaking.
So when in the act of listening, you find that the person is withholding judgment and not thinking about what he or she is going to say next, and that creates a certain disposition within the person when the person then becomes speaker.
Yes, thank you. I got a little noise going on here in construction. Yeah, and then one more thing is that the fact that there is reflection, so someone's speaking and someone's reflecting, that really slows everything down. So while the reflection's happening, so both the speaker gets to reflect on what they're saying, and the listener gets to reflect on what is being said, and all the rest of the people in the circle have some time to reflect on what's being said, and that I think creates a more reflective conversation than the quick back and forth that tends to happen in a normal conversation, where people sometimes interrupt each other or they're responding right on the heels of what another person says.
Mm-hmm. So that slowing down process then allows a greater, what you see is a greater reflection, a better, I guess, you're saying, a better reflection, a better environment for reflecting. Right?
Yeah, I think it creates more reflectiveness on everyone's part. That's how I experience it. Okay, and I'll stop there. Thank you. I feel heard.
So it's your turn, Mark, to select someone.
Edwin.
Okay, listening.
So with the experience I had, it was interesting because I could feel like a bodily resistance building up because I've never been in a situation, again, like I said before, sort of like teaching philosophy, you're just boom, boom, boom. It's sort of like really quick judgments. I don't think that judgments are necessarily a bad thing at all. It depends upon, right, Lou thinks that this type of circle is useful, and I find it useful for certain ends. But certainly there's different ends to be attained, and that might involve different sorts of interactions.
Okay, well, let me reflect that back. So what I'm hearing, you're feeling some bodily resistance to the practice, and it's different from sort of the judgments within philosophy, like philosophy teaching, where it's a different way of relating, and there's different ends. So it's sort of like these are two different means that have two different ends, and you're sort of comparing them. That each one has.
There's multiple ends, and there's nothing that stands above an experience that makes it better outside of the consequences it produces. So the idea that, for instance, people think that being judging or being critical is a negative thing. In philosophy, people don't really see that. It's not, if we say something like negative and about somebody badly, then that's something. But being critical, having critical thinking isn't a bad thing for philosophers. And it's just a matter of if it's going to cloud someone's mind so they can't hear, right? What Lou was talking about, with conflict resolution, that's obviously quite often happening, where someone's mind is thundering to say something, and they're not allowed to receive what they're hearing from the other person.
So what I think I'm getting is that the judgments are okay to criticize sort of ideas, not people. So you're kind of making that distinction, and that there is something that you're wanting to avoid is using judgments to sort of cloud your ability to listen to others. So what?
Oh, I just say when necessary, right? Certainly there's this idea of making a judgment about when you should listen and not. I mean, if a 3-year-old comes up to me and starts talking about calculus, I don't know how they can get the language for that, but certainly I wouldn't listen. And so there's definitely times and experiences in the flow of everyday experience where these skills are essential, especially with Lou's doing a conflict resolution. But I think that the variations of experience allow for different sorts of interactions that would produce different ends. But I just want to say more about my own bodily resistance. I see it as a good thing because I feel like a transformation. I don't feel like I'm resistant against it. It's definitely, my mind processes differently than others. I mean, people have different minds, the way they process, information too. So when I repeat something back to someone, I want to make sure that I'm sensing what they're saying and trying to withhold all of my judgments, as far as in a sort of sense of like a negative way, right? Not based on what the meaning of the speaker is saying.
So you have a sense, sort of a bodily discomfort or resistance, and with the practice, you're sort of noticing that, And yeah, that's the first part I was getting. I guess I was, let me see if and yeah, maybe you could repeat that again. That's the part I'm getting. It's just there's a resistance to it, a discomfort, and it's not a bad thing. It's like you're not like saying, oh, this is a bad thing. It's that you're actually sort of trying to learn and grow from it.
Right. And I think that maybe because that's what I do as a habit, because habits very much inform how we process information, how we deal with the world around us, how we interact with others. So with what Lou's doing in his work, the idea is to break the habit of just coming in and judging someone without listening, especially if there's like some conflict in a marriage or between organizations. They need to have those skills. And so those skills are useful for certain ends. And because experience is so plural and varied, there could be very much different sorts of interactions. So I just feel like most of my interactions are not like this. And the process that I'm having here is a positive process because it makes me receive information in a different way because I know I'm going to have to repeat it, right? Or to get it back and make sure the person's felt heard.
Yeah, so there's like different contexts where this type of listening is really helpful. And you're seeing that like what Lou's doing with mediation or conflict resolution is like really helpful to be able to listen sort of deeply versus maybe in a academic environment where you have to like quickly, kind of judge what people are saying sort of, and sort of a different mindset, which in a different context. So in that context, that sort of a mindset is more effective. But this is a different context. It has a practice that has a context where it's very useful.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And especially like what you all are doing with the political, bringing the left and right. People, I suppose that they would walk away, but I read some things that people are actually really deeply influenced because they have to have that position of what you're doing. They have to really be actively listening to, in order to really have the other person be heard and then have any transformation space, because those are the most thundering ideas and thoughts and biases we have, or a lot of people, at least when it comes to politics. And so, for that end, I couldn't imagine any other way of conversing. You wouldn't go back and forth like a debate. That everybody would just walk away. It's like with Socrates, when he'd walk up to people and he'd have a dialogue and he'd ask them questions, and then Socrates would walk away and the person would walk away, but no one changed their minds. So I think like when it comes to at least receiving and being able to open to change and transformation, I think this is a better format than would be like the Socratic, because the Socratic, people, one's going to be feeling humiliated because the Socrates giant of being is judging the person, making them feel smaller. And so that's one of the things with this notion of support, right? To feel heard and to feel supportive. I think it's a really important dynamic that's going on here that is crucial.
Okay, so the dynamic of the listening that we're doing within the circle you're seeing is crucial, and you're seeing the benefits of it like in a political realm instead of sort of debate or using the Socratic method where there's sort of one loser and one winner, or you feel small. And you can see that, people don't change. Whereas within this practice here, there's a listening and a sort of a potential for change and connection and overcoming those like political differences that might not happen in a debate.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate your listening skills. Thank you. It's a good archetype to model myself after. And the thing is I think it's the thing about feeling small or stronger, that is really a lot of power dynamics in communication. Who's the boss? Who's holding the power in any relationship? Mm-hmm. Power comes in to the question during conversations. Power enters always. There's always a power dynamic. It can be varied depending on the context, but there's a power dynamic. So what this tries to do, I think, too, the empathy circles are like not necessarily levels the field, but kind of gets rid of the power dynamic in the sense of intentionally. And that goes back to what Lou was talking about, the structure. The way an argument or a conversation or an empathy circle is structured is crucial. And I've seen a lot of people in philosophy who have created their own philosophy conferences and definitely have that structure in play. where it's just not a back and forth, where, in philosophy, like a person will write a paper on Hume, and then the Sartre person will ask a question about Sartre related to Hume, and the Heidegger person will ask a question about Heidegger related to, and it's just a big mess, and that's what it is. It's the thunder. There's a great article by a quote by Peter Berger. I don't know if I mentioned it last time. I keep saying thunder because I'm thinking about the Peter Berger article, but it's actually a phrase, yeah. The sound, hierophany, or the sound of God, is like thunder, and it blocks out every other sound in the universe. I'd say the same thing goes with political allegiance and other things which we hold dearly, whether rightly or wrongly. It's okay, really...
That's getting to be a lot. So, but the essence I was hearing is that whenever people get together, you're seeing that there's an aspect of power to it, in the relationship, and you're seeing... And maybe the conferences and so forth are sort of demonstrating that, like people aren't really listening. It's sort of a battle. There's sort of a power play. They're structuring, different types of structural power. And you're seeing, comparing that with the empathy circle, which sort of equalizes the power, or sort of more does away with the power, those power dynamics.
It's
10 minutes too. But
this last thing is just
okay.
I would just say, we can talk about it later, but that's necessary for democracy. When we're going to talk about democracy in this country, it's absolutely necessary, this type of environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that in terms of a democracy, this mutual listening, like we're doing in the empathy circle, is foundational, critical. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, then I'll speak to Lou.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm really glad that Mark mentioned about democracy, and because I see the empathy circle as sort of a model for democracy. So I've been thinking about that too. That the empathy circle is like a sort of a framework for democracy.
So what you're saying there is that you think. In order to promote democracy, or us to participate in a democracy, the tool of an empathy circle is a very powerful and effective tool for creating like democratic dialogue.
Exactly, yeah. And that, growing up in school, I learned about civics. You learn sort of this sort of bit of a structural, abstract sort of about the government, but you don't learn how to relate. It's like, everything's a, competition. It's a vote. We have these chambers, and here's this chamber, and you learn about this map of the structure, but I never was taught, like, how do you relate effectively in a democracy? So, I feel kind of like sad about that. It seems like a huge loss for the culture. I feel like I felt like I really lost something.
So you're remembering your education in democracy, governments, civics when you were young and growing up, and your memory of it is learning about the different parts of government and the power relationships between them, and the power of voting and parties and trying to get things passed, but not education about how do we talk to each other, how do we listen to each other, how do we do democracy by understanding each other, and you're sad that that's not part of what gets taught in physics.
Yeah, it's like
physics, civics.
Civics, yeah, civics, and. Yeah, I feel a sadness. I just felt sort of a wave of sadness come up, because it seems like there's this loss for the potential of, real connection that was, and so I see that this basic practice, and there's so many other practices to add to it, but this is a basic practice to really, this empathy circle or mutual active listening or mutual listening practice to bring into the schools, to bring into the government, that we need to bring this practice in to all these different institutions, sort of institutionalize this, to have politicians sort of, one of the requirements is that they do regular empathy circles or something like that in Congress across the aisle. And it's, sort of institutionalized.
Yeah, so you're reflecting more on, it's just really sinking in that idea that there's this missing key element in the way that we're taught to participate in democracy, which has to do with listening to each other. And it makes you very sad to realize that that's like an important component that's missing. And you would really like to see this basic practice of empathy circle, which you think is very sound for democratic functioning, to see that introduced into schools, into civic education, into city governments, and into into our government agencies, and that listening, maybe in the form of an empathy circle, become part of the regular practice of how we work with each other.
And I'm really curious how it would work in a philosophers conference. Like, what is it? What would it be like to bring this practice into, philosophers, talking with each other across the different, be it Merleau-Ponty, Hume, whoever the groups are, So just to even extend it, just to sort of reach out to Mark here.
Yeah, so you're imagining into and thinking about what would it be like to bring this kind of listening to each other, this kind of practice, into discipline areas that are traditionally like intellectual competitions, where ideas compete with each other and people argue with each other and try to win. What would it be like to bring empathic listening into that and empathy into that arena?
And the other thing I want to build on too is you had mentioned the word hope, and for me too, there's an aspect of hope in the empathy circle. In the practice is it gives me hope, and it's a hope based on experience. So I know I'll start with that first part.
Yeah, so you're also, I talked about experiencing hope when I'm in an empathy circle, and you resonate with that. You feel the same thing, that you feel that when you're participating in one.
And it's from experience too. So the experience that comes to mind is just with my family. So, there's been family different conflict, and then we've started doing these empathy circles, and we have 6, 7 of us in the living room, in the house living room, and for like 3 or 4 hours we're doing the empathy circle, talking through issues, and some are really difficult, things that naturally would get swept under the rug, or people would hold these resentments, so they'd sort of be getting pissed off with each other, having, more battles. And this sort of just slows things down. There's sort of this element of trust that's being built in the practice. Like, oh, this is a safe practice. I can, tough things can come up, but there's an aspect of safety. So that's just an example of, that I have that kind of, it's hope, but it's based on these real world experiences.
Yeah, so the hope that you feel when you do empathy circle work isn't just an intellectual hope or a wishful hope. It's actually grounded in lots of experience of you doing circles in lots of different contexts, and most strongly in your own family, where in families that's often the most difficult place to be honest and to really listen to each other. Often those problems get swept under the rug. And you have a deep experience with using this in your own family and experiencing a lot of benefits from it.
Yeah. So, and there's plenty of other experiences that the skills of listening is again, like what Mark was talking about, there's different contexts. So recently I set up the empathy tent at a church, and we had some church members come by, and a mother and her son came by, and she'd been having sort of disconnection with her teenage son, right? He's kind of being more withdrawn. She had a good connection with him when he was younger, but now they're sort of drifting apart, and it was painful to her. And she came and sat down and said, "Oh, we need this." So that we did the 3-chair empathy circle, and they started talking to each other, and the son was like, you don't listen to me, because the mother is trying to pull emotion and feeling out of her son, and he just kind of withdraw. But here she had to reflect back, she had to listen. He felt more heard. He didn't feel like, tugged on to give of himself. and they kind of went back and forth, and really, some connection was created out of that. So that was like another, visceral experience that I had of the power of this in this context, this context of, family members having a bit of disconnection.
So you're relating another recent experience of helping family members, people who are closely related, connect with each other when they had disconnection between a mother and a son, which is, parents and children are difficult.
Yeah.
Difficult relationships that commonly have disconnection in them. And so you saw again, proven to yourself again, that this practice by people who, just showed up and spent a few minutes in a chair with you, and using this practice, they were able to begin reconnecting with each other.
Yeah.
That gives you a lot of faith in the soundness of the practice.
And it was also, I felt a sense of contribution. Like I felt like deep sense of I contributed to these people's well-being, their sense of connection, which is very gratifying. I mean, it feels so good. I mean, it's like my day was made. It made my day to be able to, to do this. Like, wow, this was great. I really contributed to, in a positive way to people's lives.
Yeah, so this is another aspect of the empathy circle work that's really important to you, is the kind of contribution that it makes when you are practicing it or helping people practice it, and you see the difference that it makes for them. You feel very strongly that you're making some kind of meaningful, positive contribution to people and to the world, and there's nothing that feels better than that.
I feel deeply heard. Thank you.
Can we pause for a minute?
Uh-huh.
I have.
Okay.
Okay. So let's see. So I guess it's my turn to speak. And because we only have 3 people, I either am going back to Edwin or I'm going on to Mark again. So let's see. I will pick. I guess I'll do Mark again. So the first thing I want to say is that just comment on this. So one of the aspects of empathy circle with 4 or 5 people, which is the normal size that you would do it with, is that the vector of conversation goes to different people around the circle, and it doesn't go back and forth between 2 people. So that's another actually aspect of the structure that I think helps create more openness, more reflection, because as facilitators of the circle, we coach people not to go back and forth between 2 people. But that, like, if everybody hasn't spoken in one round, that when you pick someone that hasn't listened yet, so that they get a chance to speak, that everyone in the circle gets a chance to speak. So that's another piece of the structure that I think is important.
So another piece of the structure is the bigger group, the 4 or 5, it creates a different sort of openness where it's even functions greater than it would be a smaller group. Because even with this, we have a little bit more back and forth than would, say, a group of 6, and that creates another structure element to the circle that's beneficial.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me how little bits of structure like that can make such a big difference, because over the course of time, which I guess has been about 10 months or a year, that I learned this process from Edwin and practicing it and refined it, I've noticed how the elements of the structure work to create more reflection, more reflective dialogue, and more, I would say more reflective dialogue. And that's often what doesn't happen in a regular conversation. Mm-hmm. People go back and forth. They're very focused on making their arguments and trying to answer the person and convince them, let's say, the wrongness of their position or the error of it. And in an empathy circle, where you're not really questioning the other person. You're not interrogating them. You are just reflecting back, and then something that someone said that might have actually tweaked you, like you have something to say about it, you usually don't get to speak about that until like maybe 5 or 10 minutes later when it's finally your turn. And I might have made a note on a pad that, I want to say something about that. And so I do say something about it, but my saying about it is separated in time quite a bit from what the other person said. So I have time to reflect on it and calm down and whatever. And so does the other person. So I'll stop there.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So again, another structural element, that extension of time really is necessary for there to be serious reflection. And to have to actually tell someone what they said, means that you definitely were listening, because if you get it wrong, obviously you get it wrong. But then the space between, it sort of sinks in, sort of like maybe how something settles. It needs time to settle, and over that time, settling, it produces better outcomes.
Yes, thank you. Or certainly more capacity to listen. So it might not change my idea about what I want to say, but I have to sit with what I want to say and reflect on it and reflect on what the other person said. And just that time of sitting with it, I think, means that I hear it more, even though I may not agree with it. It may not change my mind, but I'm definitely hearing it more.
So again, that time element really, you don't have to agree with what the person's saying, but you're coming to a realization that you are hearing or listening to the person. And in the case that it's not necessary for you to totally change your mind, but at least you know that you're having reflection as you have that time to have it settle.
Yeah. And, when I'm facilitating an empathy circle, I certainly say at the beginning that the purpose of the circle is to help create mutual understanding, for me to make myself understood, and for others to make themselves understood, and to feel like they are understood because of the reflection that they're getting. And it's not the purpose of the circle for us to try to convince one another, or to judge one another, or determine the correctness or incorrectness of what anyone is saying. It's really just to help us understand each other. And I think that's a powerful purpose. And my experience is people who come into the circle with like wanting to problem solve and wanting to educate others, about XYZ, they are frustrated with the process. And if they hang out with it long enough, and they usually have trouble reflecting back what people are saying, because they're very anxious to tell people things and they can't listen easily. But if they hang out with the process long enough, then they usually find some benefit in it, and they realize the benefit of listening for understanding, as opposed to listening to decide, do I agree or disagree with this person, and how can I correct them, and how can I, educate them about the correct point of view.
So many educators, if you notice with the empathy or the experience you've had, the empathy circle, many educators come in and they feel frustration. I described it as a bodily sensation, which wasn't negative, but I felt that as well. And but the frustration kind of lessens as they get into the habit of the as the structure takes effect, and it allows for there to be more openness and the ability to understand someone and not critique and correct, but to understand and to get, I guess, and grasp where the person's coming from, grasp the person's perspective.
Yes, thank you. I feel heard. Let's see, is there more that I want to say? About my experience of empathy circles? I don't really. I think I'm pretty complete. So thank you for hearing me. So it's your turn to speak, Mark.
Is mine. And so I'll speak to you, Lou.
Okay.
So
And Edwin gets left out. No, I'm kidding.
No, that's good. It's shifting, creating
Yeah.
different dynamics.
Okay.
So one of my experiences during this is that feeling of being slowed down. I usually, when I work, I think it goes back to habits, how habits are formed. Different people will come to the tent or to the conversation with different habits. So my habits are sort of like, I'll work on like 9 projects just to spice it up in a day. And I'm not the person that just sits down and goes, right? I have a mixed bag of things that's always going on. So, right, I feel the presence of it, my sense slowing down and actually grasping what people are saying much easier. But that habit takes time. So I don't think like just from one circle, like someone's going to be changed. But this has a better opportunity to actually create more democratic, open conversation than does debates. Can you imagine if the presidential debates had a empathy circle? And it would be, what would they say? I mean, it would be really quite interesting. But anyway, the feeling is I have that feeling of the slowing down. And as I practice it, because it needs to be a practice, I feel like I'm getting better. But again, my original habits, my habits are just structured in such a way that it's not the same. So it makes me slow down, which is good because I can understand people better, I think.
So what I'm getting is you're reflecting on actually how you're experiencing the circle right now as we're doing it. And you're noticing that, your normal way of working is to have a lot of things going and to have your mind zipping around to different things, switching between things. And that this process of listening and reflecting back is you are feeling the effects of the slowing down that happens, and that feels different. And you're noticing that. And if I'm understanding you, you're saying that you like what you're learning from it, or what you're experiencing from it. And you do think that there might be positive effects in politics, like what if the presidential debates, had this kind of thing where there was reflective listening going on, that might have a positive effect.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And one of the things also is when someone says something to another, the person can always respond by asking a question. Actually, sometimes people do this in courts or in conversation just to buy time so they can figure out what to say. So because that's not an option, it really makes one zero in on what the other person is saying. And that's why I do think would be the best skill to have for democratic town halls, right? And instead of Senator, whatever, here's a question from someone online, okay? And then they give their spiel. It's already prefab. It's already based on if they're going to win or not, pretty much. And they're going to say what the people want to hear, get elected. It's everything. If you're looking at a newscast, it's just talking points, talking heads, giving talking points. This is just radically different than that.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're noticing also that what happens in normal conversation is the listener is usually thinking about questions that they have that pop up for them about what the speaker is saying, and so then they ask those questions, and their perspective is more about taking the information and figuring out what questions they have about it or what sort of interrogating they want to do around it, rather than just taking in what the person is saying and reflecting it back, and that those are really 2 different mental processes, and that you think that the getting out of the question asking mode into just the receiving mode and reflecting back, that creates more understanding, or you like that, you think that's a good thing. And again, you're reflecting on what would presidential debates be like if or even things on a news program, interviews on a news program, where if this process were used, how that might really shift it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
No, that's right. I would just say one thing is that I don't necessarily, again, outside of a context, I don't think it necessarily has any particular benefit, any particular skill. Habits manifest in contexts of experience, and then they produce different consequences or not. And so, conflict resolution, politics, absolutely so important. How I'm feeling right now, crucial. One thing about democracy is, like, going back to what Edwin said about how he learned democracy in civics class. I learned the same way. And basically what we learned what democracy democracy is, came out of John Locke and drawing from other philosophers and founding fathers, and came this system of election and officials and organization and government. But that's missing a lot, because the word democracy goes back to the Greek, demo, people, and krasi, power, krasia, power, right? So Aristotle wrote a lot about power, right? Power over one's will. So krasi in the democracy is power, but it also can be rule. And so if you're thinking in terms of power, then you think about, we're creating a democratic environment. And this is great for creating a democratic environment, because you're trying to take away the power dynamics, I guess you could say. And so many of the things that everyone said. There's the great article that is John Dewey's Democracy is a Way of Life. That's a really good one. He says, yeah, there's this other stuff with democracy, with elections and all this, but then there's a way of life. Going back to what Edwin said when he sat the parent or the child and the mother down. That's democracy is a way of life. That's what Dewey was saying. And I teach that in my class, and I think it's a really good way of thinking about democracy. And this skill, again, not that it would produce better understanding in any context, but for that context, absolutely necessary and important.
Okay, so I think I'm getting two things from what you said. The first is that this practice of reflective listening and taking the time to do that isn't inherently better or worse than other ways of relating. It just depends on the context. So I think that was your first point. And you definitely think it's useful in this context and in, like, political context. And the second point was about how civics is taught and what is democracy, what are we taught about what democracy is and how do we practice it. And that from your perspective, or you shared that if you go back to the original meaning of the word democracy, it has to do with people and power. And the way that this practice relates to that is that it distributes the power, or it kind of tries to either equalize the power or remove the up-down power differentials. And you think that's very positive. You think that's actually what democracy is.
I think,
and that's why this might help us practice it better.
It's the best way to promote this notion of democracy, or one of the best. This notion of democracy as a way of life. If you think about what's at stake when we go to the polls or when people are elected, and you think about this last presidential election, okay, what happens then, and you can go back to any president, depending what side one's on. There's a lot at stake. And to make judgments, informed judgments, right? Informed judgments are coming from other people, from being aware of everything external to you, not just your own judgments about what you think about this person as a candidate or not. And that requires one to really reach out and grasp what others are saying. And this, again, so this format of doing that is very conducive for that. And there's just a lot at stake. There's so much at stake. So the more informed you think, and the more it resonates or settles, sort of like the snow settling, being able to just lay and then finally be able to be good enough to pack into a thought, maybe. It's really necessary because there's just so much at stake. I think that's the point. The main point is just there's so much at stake. We have to have the most informed ideas before we go to the polls or make elections or practice democracy as a way of life.
So what I'm getting is that you're saying that you want to see democracy practiced as a way of life, and that there's so much at stake politically and socially in the choices that we make, like elections, and that for people to make good choices, they need to be informed. And for people to be informed, they need to be open to taking information from others, and that means really listening to them. And that's how this process relates to that. And you just think that that's really important, and you'd like to see that happening more.
I feel deeply heard. Thank you. I think that's right. And one of the things is like how judgment is in the mix of everything. Again, going back to this idea of judgment. Again, like the kids in my classes will say, "Don't judge," and "Don't be so critical." And it's generally just the common parlance we talk about. We talk about judgments and critical thinking, that they're negative. But somehow, right, there has to be judgments, like when we're just talking, even listening, I have to judge like which parts of what you're saying am I going to repeat back to you. I feel a little bit more pressured because, I mean, you two are like vets in the empathy circle. So like my idea of like trying to make sure I grasp the main point, and that's a judgment. What do I want to what do I want to focus on? You said 8 things, and I think I'll say 2 of them because those seem to be the main thing. So those judgments are always mingling. This is the experience. Like we have these thoughts, right? And they're abstractions. And we think they're rigid and secure and unmoving, but they're not, because they mingle in experience in different ways. And so the role of judgment, how does judgment play? Like, especially in real life, I mean, we're here, it's structured, but outside of it, how does one make a judgment to, in this case, listen to another? You can see like in relationships, it's vital. You can see like a lot of relationships, the back and forth is like, you're not hearing me. You're not listening to me. Did you hear what I said? It's this sort of thing. So in relationships, you can imagine somebody who's close to you, very crucial. Someone who's not, or a stranger, it'd probably be best to listen, but maybe they don't have time. You still have to make a judgment. Which person, who you're going to hear and who you're going to practice this skill on. That's a judgment.
Yeah. So let me try to reflect this back. So you're reflecting on the topic of judgment, and that judgment is something human beings do. It's something we do, and we can't really turn that off because we do that. But I thought I heard you making the distinction between being judgmental, like criticizing people, versus using your judgment to do something else, like to really listen to someone, and rather than using your judgment to say, well, I agree with you or I disagree with you, using your judgment to say what parts of what you're saying are most important to you, using my judgment for that, and then choosing to reflect those things back, because that's how I'm using my judgment. And so that was one point that you made, and then there was another point which I think I'm losing, about the different ways that we use judgment in life, whether that's a judgment about who to vote for, or a judgment about whether we think a policy is a good idea, or a judgment in our relationships. Are we judging each other versus listening to each other? So I feel less clear about that second point.
No, that's okay. I still heard. Thank you. Let's move on. I think we're 10. I got the page up.
Okay. All right. So I guess it's my turn to talk. So I'll talk to Edwin.
Okay.
Yeah. So another aspect, there was something that Mark said when he was speaking that made me think of this, and it has to do with something that happens for me when I'm trying to express myself in an empathy circle, and someone not even an empathy circle. If I'm expressing myself and somebody is reflecting back what they're hearing, that process of having my thoughts and my feelings reflected back helps me get clearer about what I'm feeling and thinking. So I've definitely had the experience of having something very strong, that I'm very emotional. I'm trying to express something that I feel strongly about, and I'm talking, and I don't feel like I'm being very clear, and the person's reflecting back what they're hearing me say, and I'm thinking, no, that's not quite it, and so then I try again, and it might take me 2 or 3 times to actually say what I'm trying to say, but part of the way I'm getting clear about it is that what I am saying is being reflected back to me. So there's a clarifying process that happens when what I'm saying is being reflected back to me. And that's something that is a positive aspect of what goes on in empathy circles.
Okay, so one of the positive aspects of an empathy circle that you experience is sort of this clarifying, as a speaker, a clarifying quality that you're sharing what you're thinking. Maybe you're not quite even clear, or you're sharing it, you're getting the reflection while that's happening. It starts clarifying your own ideas or own experience. And you find that very positive, and maybe even you come up with a new idea or a new experience from that process, some new energy, I guess, adding here.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the ways, actually, it's one of the reflective aspects of the circle. When I talked about that, I think that process helps create an environment of reflection where everybody can learn more because there's time to reflect on what's happening. And I think I've had in empathy circles or in conversations where I'm being reflected, I've had new insights that I didn't have before, or just clearer, getting clarification about what aspects of what's happening are important to me. Yeah, and I think that's I was saying earlier that in conversations where people are just arguing with each other and they're trying to convince each other of something, I think less, the more heated that is, the less likelihood that someone's going to have an insight or a shift where they look at something differently, than an environment where things are more reflective and people have a chance to be heard and to hear others deeply, and then just reflect on it, and then decide for themselves. Oh, I never looked at it that way. I never looked at it that way before. Yeah, so I'll stop.
So you're comparing the aspect of the listening in an empathy circle as with sort of more of a heated competitive, where you're in a heated competitive, people are not really listening to each other. That in the listening, in this with the empathy circle or reflective listening, do you have more of a space for clarifying your views and for actually coming up with new views? And that there's sort of an opportunity, there's a space for that to happen. Whereas if it's a very heated, in comparison, nothing much new happens, not more clarity or not more new ideas would come up.
Yeah, thank you. I feel very heard. Is there more that I want to say? I guess the only other thing I'll say is that, I've been astounded sometimes at situations or relationships where there's little or no hope of people understanding each other or resolving differences, and then they participate in this process, and there isn't necessarily a solution, but you can see people getting past their head banging, and they see the possibility of openness or the possibility of connecting in a way that might produce a different result happens, and people are surprised by that. And it's happened often enough for me that I'm not surprised. I actually have faith in it, but I think that's something that's inspiring to see, and that I've seen enough times that I have a lot of confidence in it.
So you're inspired and have confidence in having seen that people who are in really deep conflict with each other, really butting heads, that if they start listening to each other, empathically listening or actively listening to each other, that they may not solve the problem, but it sort of creates a space where sort of there's more possibilities there. People are sort of like see other possibilities, even if they don't really solve the problem. And that you've seen that happen a lot. And yeah,
Yeah, and I'm recalling a circle you and I were in, Edwin, at a political rally where we had two people sit down to try to talk to each other.
Oh,
We were facilitating them, and one of them was, like a politico. He had a long history of representing a certain position. And when he started to try to do when we invited him to do the process, he was interrupting the other person, and he was saying, well, wait a minute, we were asking him to reflect back, and he was saying, well, but I want to say whatever to this person. I said, well, yeah, you'll get a chance, but, just reflect back what you're hearing. And, he couldn't do it. And so I said, he kept arguing with me. So I said to him, well, can you reflect back what you're hearing me say right now? I was asking him, do you want to participate in this process? Like, this process is we listen and we reflect back. And he would say something, well, you're trying to control me or something like that. And so I said to him, well, can you just reflect back what you're hearing me say? So I was inviting him to just do that little bit. And it took like 5 minutes or 10 minutes of calling him into, can you just reflect back what you're hearing right now? And then me reflecting him for a few minutes so that he could experience what that's like. And then me asking him to do it. And he eventually calmed down, and he became a person, not a position. And he actually began to participate in dialogue. And it was a struggle, but it was a compassionate struggle. And he did shift. It was really cool to see that happen.
mm-hmm. So you're just referring to a experience we had in the empathy tent where you were facilitating a dialogue between two political people, and one of them, it was just having really difficulty getting him just to do listening, to listen. He kind of had his position that he wanted to say. He said, you're kind of controlling me. And it was, you were compassionately trying to get him just to reflect back what it is that you were saying, to hear you and to reflect back. And he was struggling with that, but he finally was able to do it. Instead of just having his political position, he was able to reflect back what you had to say instead of him just speaking. And then it started a real deeper, mutual listening, and it ended, pretty positively with some real connection and mutual understanding.
Yeah, thank you. I feel heard. So you can. I'm
Okay.
done with my turn.
Great. Then I'll speak to Mark. Yeah, that was quite that it was in the empathy tent, and there was a communist and a right-winger person on the right, Trump supporter, and when the right-winger reached out his hand to shake with the communist, and the communist said, "I don't know who you are. I'm not going to shake your hand." So there was there was this, they were both willing to sit down, they didn't know what they were getting into, but that was kind of like the level of, mistrust when it started, this story that Lou's talking about.
So the story when we were with the guy from Politico, there's other people were just going to greet each other, and things seemed to be going well. They're willing to do it, but then almost like even upon greeting, shaking hands, there's mistrust entered, and I'm assuming that's part of the sort of the holding, the refusal to listen to another and holding on to one's opinions, ideas, beliefs.
Yeah. So and then it was really difficult. So Lou, I started the mediation, and Lou came in, and then we're sort of co-doing it, and then. But it was like the person on the right just wanted to sort of play games, just speak from his position. And Lou just kind of grabbed the hold of it and just came to it got so intense. Like, it was like Lou was saying, "You're not listening." I mean, or it was like so intense. And then he said, "But I am." He said, "No, you're not." But finally, he kind of got it, and it did, and yeah. So if you just want to reflect that part, but it was the energy of it. It wasn't just like being nice. It was like it was getting heated and energetically, Lou is kind of really matching him energetically. It's pretty amazing.
Interesting. So the initial mistrust escalated and a little bit, and Lou came in, and there was another sort of sense of or someone else recognizing. So I'm coming out from the outside and recognizing that the person's not listening, and then eventually, even though it started off very heated, over time wearing down, like waterfall drops on a rock over time, just wearing down, things settled and were greater disposition for listening. But that took
compassionately. It was done in a compassionate, with the intention of fostering connection. So I think that's what really helped bring people together. And it ended with the Trump supporter, right-wing person saying, "Oh, I'm so thirsty," and the communists giving him his water bottle. I'm drinking. So it went from no handshake to here. You can drink from my water bottle. So you just want to reflect that part.
Yeah, many different dynamics happening, a lot of different interactions at the beginning, just trust, and then heated up and settled, and then an extension of grace, an extension of compassionate act.
Yeah.
A compassionate act ending with a compassionate act.
And so that's like what we're doing here. This is like I guess this is like training wheels. This is sort of like a practice session for being able to do that. If people can stay with this practice and just keep, practicing, and sort of it's that rewiring of the brain. You're saying, oh, it's a little uncomfortable, but if you stay with it, it's like slowly rewires your brain to have that presence and that listening that leads to, I think, one of the directions, it's sort of the foundational practice. It's the foundational exercise to being able to like facilitate these type of dialogues with others.
So needing to start with the training wheel before you get the Harley or whatever, and start with practicing, and over time with practicing you can actually grasp the skill in such a way that you can facilitate between people.
And that's the empathy circle. Just this simple practice kind of creates, it's just practice that sort of grounds one in the mindset. So I see that I see the empathy circle as that foundational, as I think the best that I've seen foundational first step practice. It's not the end, but it's just a really good first step in this sort of building a culture of empathy.
Mm-hmm. So I have to start with people's habits, being able to practice the skill, and then that serves as the foundation or groundwork upon with the culture, that can perform or enact, practice these skills.
And a deepening of it, which we don't do too much with, consciously or explicitly in the empathy circle, but it is the deepening is to start speaking about identifying, naming, and expressing, and having reflected our visceral felt experiences. So that's sort of the empathy, which is in feeling, right? So I think that a deepening of this practice is the getting deeper into the felt experience that we're all having here, or individually or together.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, the practice of it is the foundation, but then maybe another level would be this sort of dynamic where someone's felt experience of the event, of the phenomena of listening, is maybe put another layer on top of that foundation, or that sort of maybe movement to the culture of empathy.
Yeah, it's to a deepening of this practice, I think, is an identifying and a naming of our own felt experience in the moment. So, if I look into myself, feel into myself, I have a spaciousness. There's a quality of spaciousness that I'm sensing by having been heard, and in this dialogue. I'm feeling excitement about identifying the aspects of empathy, because I think this is very rich. So I feel a oh, this is exciting to be together, to be naming all these aspects. And I just see the potential of it, but I feel a real excitement in myself. But I also am feeling like a sort of an impatience. I want something deeper. So there's sort of that. So it's trying to name the feelings that we're having in the moment. And you just right off the bat started naming your, visceral discomfort with the practice, so that's like, that's a going deeper into just naming, oh, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable here. I mean, that is like beautiful, perfect.
An experience when you're feeling into yourself, it seems like the two things are two of the main things, maybe are two key things, is the feeling of excitement, because you're in the moment and you're having these forms of recognition, these skills that are being practiced, but then also a sort of impatience for something more. And this is very crucial for you need to recognize this, how one is feeling one into oneself.
Yeah. And it's the I'm feeling a spaciousness with us here. So I feel like an openness and a spaciousness is one quality. And yeah, maybe I just get a reflection on that first.
So in our circle here, you feel an openness and a spaciousness.
Yeah.
In terms of how you're feeling into yourself, you're sensing. So maybe in addition to the excitement or the impatience, sense of openness and.
Yeah. And so I noticed that, and I think that's the other quality of an empathy circle. If it goes long enough, that there's like an opening that happens. It's sort of like, metaphorically, the heart opening, sort of a trust opening that, oh, I can share more of what it is that I'm viscerally feeling. Maybe 2 hours might not be enough, but you go 3 hours, or in a mediation where it's like 4 hours, that it's like you start trusting, and I start opening, and that's really the deepening of the I think the direction that the empathy circle can go is that trust building and that opening and the deepening.
So over time, as the experience unfolds, 2, 3, 4 hours, you sense that you feel that there's a sense of opening is metaphorically sort of like with the heart.
Yeah.
Of being compassionate and open to others. And that takes time over time. And that's important for building trust as well.
Yep. I feel heard. Thanks. Feel fully heard. So it's your turn.
Okay. Well, there's so many wonderful things. I do feel that. I feel that sense. Really do.
Who do you want to reflect to?
Yeah, I'll go to Edwin again.
Okay.
Okay. So you're also feeling that sense of openness.
Yeah, it's almost as though it's a sense of relaxation after a while, and a sense of just calmer. Not worried about, because the sense of like when you do a habit, whatever it might be, when you start doing it, it's harder. It's more difficult to perform. And take like dribbling a basketball. I'm sure like every kid, first time they were never good, and maybe they got better. But that's every habit. Every habit, the initial, and that I'm thinking psychologically how much starting a new habit, the beginning of it's so difficult. And what I sense what you were saying is that though that difficulty is real, if you stay with it, you experience this openness, you experience this sense of maybe possibility, and I think that's right. And it might be something very based in evolution, in the sense of the way the body or neurological system works, the way the brain works, be able to, have things resonate. It's like across time, as time expands and unfolds, it's a sort of resonance, right? Things are settling, and there's a feeling of trust. I do feel that, very much so. But it takes time. I think it really does take time for it, and patience, right? It takes patience to make that happen.
So what I'm hearing is that for anything new, you just identify anything sort of new. There's a process, maybe a little awkwardness to begin with, like in doing the empathic listening practice. But with time, you get better at it, and you're just identifying that you're feeling more calm, more relaxed with the practice. But there is a sort of a patience. You have to stay with it to sort of get over that, maybe sort of that hump, to get to that, get better at the practice.
Right. And our body, like our habits are fun. We are our habits. That's what James says. We are habits. And so to have something like this, what we're doing, to come in and to have people just try this, it's sort of like going to the delicatessen or the bakeries. If you tried this new pastry, sort of thing. And it's sort of a different sort of sense. It's admitted. One of the things I've been doing, Lou, we might want to talk about this, is the idea of the possibility of what virtual reality might be able to do if you could have someone, I guess you maybe call it something like embodiment transference, where there's a story and someone would become different, have different roles and different senses and it's sort of like a role playing, but in VR. And that effectiveness as well, because then one could write many different types of scripts and different types of stories and almost like just transfer a person in the experience, the simulation is not perfect, but where you have to defend, like for instance, a conflict resolution at a business or something, or imagine like, okay, you're going in there as this role, and then you got to switch to the person you're arguing against. And then in VR, like, okay, you see the person, and then you're actually that person. And then you have to think about in terms of being that person. So I think that's really relevant to this skill. Another way of bringing about a transformation or pause, maybe.
Yes, so you're seeing it. Have another aspect that you're seeing in terms of role play using virtual reality, in the sense that you put yourself into someone else's shoes, literally into their role through virtual reality, and that would kind of add to that would just be another aspect of deepening, I guess, the connection, understanding, or.
Right. And you mentioned feeling into yourself, right? The idea. But then it's a simulation. Of course, we're going to have our own brains and biases, but if you have to, it's similar sort of, it's not forcing, it's a simple sort of invitation to try a different habit of being. And so in this case with VR, I think it could be something where, knowing we are ourselves, and you still experience maybe what it might be like to be someone else. And that could be another way of, I think, bringing about a culture of empathy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So doing these role plays through VR could kind of help support creating a culture of empathy. And you're also saying that, doing anything new, I think you mentioned that earlier, anything new takes, even new pastry or something is, there's just a process. I mean, maybe, I don't know, it's just, it's something. Anything new is maybe a bit challenging, but just seeing you're looking at the larger, building a culture of empathy, that kind of doing these role plays in VR could contribute to that.
And I think what you and Lou both mentioned, this idea of staying in it a little bit, and allowing it to resonate within oneself, to have an effect. I mean, the story with the person with political tent and Edwin, you've made comments referring to this, the idea of sticking with it and then having an experience. So people oftentimes want to just make quick judgments and just say no, but it takes patience, it takes this time to really hear others. And I think that does bring about a certain type of transformation. Whether it's going to be useful in certain situations is totally dependent upon a particular context. So it can't have any value outside of, I don't see any moral sense or behavior or habit that's moral. I don't that is good or bad outside of a context of some sort of relevance of a relation between two people or a person, a thing, or other non-human animals.
I'm not sure if I quite got that, but that you're talking about context. There's different contexts, and it's like what we do depends on the context. Maybe.
Well, no, it's just the practice. The circle is so important because it's got the structure, which Lou mentioned. So the structure is important to create the habit. And then when you have the habit, you go out in the messiness of experience, and then you have the judgments or the idea of when it's important, and that's always another thing. That's another because you can still say it's not important even though you know the habit. But I think fundamentally in the experience of the circle, because the structure is a certain way, it can help, like you said, rewire, or at least reconfigure some ways in which you process information.
Oh, uh-huh.
Doing it helps to process information differently.
So you're kind of like looking at, like within the circle, we have sort of a way of being, a certain, mindset, way of relating. And how does that work when we go outside of this agreement, of this structure? This is a structure that we're practicing, having this practice. And when we go outside of the structure, out into just life, like, what do we sort of carry with us, and then what do we do within those different contexts, the different contexts that we go into? Different contexts are going to need different sort of ways of relating or being.
Right, and I think that having the ability to actively listen is crucial, because you can have it for particular uses.
Okay. So you're sort of like practicing active listening here, and then having practiced it here, when you go into those different contexts, that could come in handy then.
Absolutely. And every relationship, I'd say, what relationship doesn't? I mean, active listening, every relationship, because if you think about it, somebody even in a job, of a boss, there still would be there's a relationship, and between partners, there's a relationship. So everywhere, I mean, it's pretty much, so I don't think that it's not unimportant I'm not saying it's just certain contexts, because every relationship, I think, it's necessary. And I think, like, one of the things you said before about care, and one of the things I've noticed in the history of empathy is that when psychologists took a hold of the word Einfühlung, and you translated empathy from Einfühlung into the English, and the empathy was what coined the word empathy in English was coined like 1909 or something. That they originally, to think of, like, from a psychiatrist or a psychologist's point of view, to understand and grasp the other's perspective. So you already have this active listening woven in to empathy. So I'd say it'd be crucial part of empathy. But my thought is, like, it also involves care. Some of the art or the books that people have written recently against empathy or whatnot, the idea is that they're separating care from, right, perspective taking. And I think, like, if we're really talking about a full pluralistic, powerful notion of empathy, we can't ignore this foundational part of care, how the role of care is involved. If you're going to empathically listen to somebody, you have to care about that person, right? Any of us can just shut off the computer and walk away, or we can not care. So that care, I think, is vital. It's important. And I don't think there's anything in which, whether even with the German tradition of projecting oneself into an object, that involves care. You have to decide what you're caring for. And the same thing, too, with psychologists. I think it's woven into the idea of empathy. And so separations between empathy and care, I don't think are quite right, at least from a historical perspective.
Yeah, so there's sort of two aspects there. One I was hearing is that the learning to do active listening, and if you take it out into the world, like, how do you take that? I mean, got the alarm just went off. It's helpful in any relationship. So any relationship you have, when you're dealing in work relationships, anyone where there's just people relating, the skill here, learn the practice of active listening, is going to be helpful for that. And then the other part I was hearing is you're looking at the relationship of care and empathy, and that some people try to separate care and empathy, and you say sort of just empathizing with someone is, in a sense, caring. So they're very interwoven, and you can't really separate them that easily, or they're not so inseparable. Sort of like being willing to empathize with someone is caring in some sense. But that was the 10 minutes to our your.
Maybe official scorecard.
I'll speak Lou then.
Okay.
Yeah, I find it interesting how Mark brings up how he relates these like empathy and care, empathy and power. So bringing up these big concepts and sort of relating them to each other, I just find very interesting. I can sort of sense these energies, and I kind of enjoy the thinking about them.
So you're stimulated by the relationships that Mark is bringing up between empathy and other things, other big ideas like power or relationships.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I'm kind of trying to think what is coming up for me. I think there was one part I guess I wanted to go back to a little bit, was we talked about about power and empathy and democracy, and it ties in with right now I've been calling it the empathy circle, but I thought we could even call it a democracy circle. The name doesn't kind of really matter. It's like maybe in different contexts, within the political sphere, saying, hey, we're having a democracy circle might sort of resonate more with people too. So that was something I had thought of in terms of naming what it is that we're doing.
So this discussion this morning is stimulating you to think about other possibly using other terms for an empathy circle where that practice is being used, but maybe using a different name so that it's more appealing to the people who are there, like saying a democracy circle.
And so I noticed that my brain is a little I've come to a spot where I'm not sure what to say next. So I'm just kind of sitting, I'm kind of looking, just feeling myself. And it's I'm not really sure what to say next.
Yeah, so you've reached a spot in the conversation where, you're not necessarily feeling something strong right away that you want to say, and so you're taking some time to reflect on, what is in you and how have you been stimulated? What else might you want to say about this topic?
And I sort of appreciate the space to be able to just say that. What did come up for me is I've been in public speaking. I sometimes feel kind of anxious, and part of the anxiety comes is I want to be able to speak authentically, but then if I feel a little anxiety or something, it kind of shuts down, and I can become like a deer in the headlights, kind of don't know what to say, and I get afraid, and then nothing comes up, and it's like a self-reinforcing kind of a quality, and I thought that the way to really address that is just to name it. It's what is coming up for me is that I feel like a deer in the headlights, and that's a way to just name whatever is there. And even if it's I'm feeling a little anxiety, I'm feeling like a deer in the headlights, nothing's coming up. That's something that's there. And it might be a way to sort of work through those fears and anxieties that are there.
So, what I'm hearing is feeling the safety and spaciousness that you have in the circle with us right now to say, well, I'm not quite sure what I want to talk about, and I'm just going to take a minute and reflect on that. It reminds you of times when you are speaking publicly and you feel, when there's a pause like that, you're not quite sure what you want to, you feel a lot of anxiety, and that creates a negative cycle of the anxiety makes it more uncertain of what you want to say, and that makes you more anxious, and it kind of spirals out, and you're having an insight that maybe a way to short circuit that is to just admit what you're feeling and saying, I'm feeling anxious right now, and that might take the edge off, and you might be able to have more presence and figure out what you want to say next.
Yeah, and I'm really because it's I've been really I can feel sort of this constriction that happens, when that happens, is sort of like a fear. And I'm really wondering, what is underneath that? Can I can feel a visceral constriction that kind of, and then I become sort of mesmerized by the constriction. It's weird. It's I'm constricted. It's almost like mesmerizing of the constriction itself, and it adds to another form of, it's the craziest thing. It's like this, it's like, what is this constriction that I've got? And it's like, I'm just looking at it, and it's just like, it's like, it's weird. Yeah, it's strange.
So you're aware that when you think about those kind of circumstances, you're aware that what grips you is fear,
Mm-hmm.
and that makes you curious about, so what is that fear about?
Yeah.
And thinking about that, and you're really curious about it, and that sitting with that and examining it also leaves you kind of stuck in it, or leaves you, or just in it. You're just in it, not stuck necessarily, but your curiosity about it is piqued, and so you like examining it. But then that also adds to the constriction and the waiting and the anxiety.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's even a level of mesmerizing. It's like I feel mesmerized, it's like you know, I don't know how else to say it, but just kind of like, it's like, it's almost magical. It just kind of draws my attention somehow, and just, I don't know, it's just a very strange dynamic. So
yeah, so you're mesmerized by you realize that you kind of get mesmerized by that pattern, by that cycle of activity.
Yeah. So I can't remember, but I lost track of time. So I feel fully heard. That was very helpful to kind of sit with it and just look at it and to be able to express it. So I found that very helpful. And I see that as part of the empathy circle too, is say wherever you are, wherever you are is positive, is fine. And this is a space to, feel into your own experience and share it and be heard, and, a space to do this in a sort of a safe way.
Yeah, so you're reflecting on, this is another aspect of being in an empathy circle, is that if you do talk about whatever's coming up for you, which is that's one of the rules of the empathy circles, you don't have to follow the topic. It's more important to follow whatever's actually coming up for you. And that if you do that, if you follow that principle, you can actually have deep personal insights, and, like the insight that you just had.
Yeah, I feel fully heard. Yeah, thank you, Lou.
So I'll talk to Mark. I moved to say several things. So one is to Edwin. So the group in Sacramento that I'm part of, the Authentic Leadership Center, and the leadership training we put on helps people to have exactly those kinds of insights, and helps them actually to deal with whatever fear or whatever are the root of those things. So, I'll just say that. you want to work on that, come to Sacramento. And
right, that leadership training, you see, and this is what I'm hearing from both of you throughout, is a lot what you're understanding about the practice is based on experiences and seeing results, seeing transformation. So you're seeing those in the training, the leadership training, you're seeing similar things to what Edwin was just experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly the kind of thing that the environment helps people to see and helps them do something about it. The second thing is what Mark was saying about perspective taking and role playing. So I actually have a lot of experience with, and this is also from the leadership training that I do, with helping people to gain insight by using role playing. And the role playing can either be, you play yourself and another person plays the person that you're having a situation with or a problem with. Or it could be reversed, where you ask the person to take the play the role of the other person, and maybe I would play them. And because you get perspective from actually playing the role of the other person, and having to think of what they would say, and and you kind of know what they would say because they've said it to you or whatever. You've had interactions with them, so a few things that they say. And by starting a role play where you at least start with a line or two of what they say, you can get a lot of insight into that person's perspective by playing them. And then and this is without VR. I mean, this is just, doing it with people. And then the other process that we use that's surprisingly powerful is to have the person play both roles. So they play themselves and they play the other person. You set up two chairs and they maybe start in their own chair and they say something, they do their half of the conversation. And then when they've said whatever they want to say, they switch to the other chair and they respond as the other person. And there's a slowing down of the process that happens because they're switching. And there's also insights get generated because they are switching perspectives back and forth. Mm-hmm. And that's a really powerful process. And it's very low tech. It doesn't require virtual reality. Right. And I'm sure actually doing it in VR probably would add a dimension to it, maybe, that might be interesting. But I do think, yeah, so role-playing and these different techniques of role-playing, I've seen it do very powerful things in terms of people creating understanding for themselves or understanding of another person.
Mm-hmm. So in these leadership trainings, you've introduced role-playing for different people, for their development, and there's many different aspects to it. One is which they have to take out a role on somebody, but then there's other aspects where they have to play themselves and then the opposing person, and have to sort of like maybe be playing chess against oneself when we switch back and take on different roles. And you see results going back to before about the experiences, right? Having, in addition to just seeing what Edwin was experiencing in those leadership training, but seeing that very much what we're doing here, the empathic listening or active listening, is within this. It seems like it's woven in to this process of role playing.
Yes, thank you. On the other note I had was about care and empathy being linked, and I think so. I don't think actually that they are inseparable. So I think there are people that have the ability to sense the feelings and the desires of others, and they use that knowledge, that ability to sense that. They use that to actually take advantage of other people. And so I think there is empathy going on there, which is that they have the ability to sense what is going on in another person, which is what I think of as being empathic. And you could then offer empathy to the person by communicating back what you're understanding about them, but you could also use that information to take advantage of them and harm them or manipulate them or get them to do something that you would like that's not necessarily in their interest. And that's a dangerous aspect of having the capacity for empathy.
I'm not sure if I'm hearing you correctly. I think I got you. I think I heard what you said. That this debate, this notion between empathy and care they're not inseparable. You said initially, and then the idea that empathy, though, is defined and thought to be as a type of perspective, tasting, or sensing, but then not caring. And so you would not, I think if I hear you correctly, you would not think that that's the best form of empathy, or would you say that is, maybe it doesn't matter about the word, I'm just not sure if I'm understanding.
Yeah, and I realize that my comments kind of have implications for what is the definition of empathy, and I know there are lots of different definitions. So some people would define empathy. Hold on. Yeah. Some people would define empathy as including that component of care. And I guess I am defining empathy as the ability to sense what's going on in another person, but not necessarily what you do with that information. I do think that it is for me, the purpose of developing empathy and using empathy is to show care for other people, to understand other people and to show care for them. And I guess you could call that. So I don't like to talk in terms of good and evil. I don't think really in those terms. But I would say that using empathy to help people, to understand them and to support them, to help them understand themselves and to help them and support them in whatever their goals are, that's a positive form of empathy. And you could say that there's a negative form, which is that using that understanding to meet your own needs without regard to the needs of others is, that's not really contributing to society in the way that I like to.
Yeah, I think I understand what you mean. And now that there seems to be these multiple ways of thinking about empathy, but you'd separate them more into like a negative or a positive empathy, where positive empathy would be sensing what another's feeling, but also caring. Not the kind of care that I'm listening to you and sensing, because that involves a care, but just that I'm understanding and sensing, and then I care in some sort of compassionate action. That would be more positive, I think, for you. And then the one that a lot of people write about when I talk about empathy is just grasping the perspective and using it maliciously, maybe not in an evil way, but at least maliciously, or for their own benefit. So that's why I sense that you said that there's just two types of common ways of thinking about empathy. One that includes the care, which would involve the compassion, and one that is just grasping the perspective and then not really caring for the person's well-being.
Yeah. And I don't think, the overwhelming majority of empathy that I see in the world happening and that I experience myself is people using that capacity to sense what's going on in others, to understand them and to help to create connection and to create positive outcomes. The other kind, which is where people use that information just for selfish purposes, to meet their own needs without regard to how it might impact others. I see that happening much less often, but it is there. It's a possibility, and it shouldn't be ignored.
So from your perspective, you're sensing that what you call more we call positive empathy seems to be more prevalent and more active in the world than this other one where people would just be able to take a person's perspective and manipulate and use that information for their own benefit and not care for another.
Yes, thank you. I feel heard.
So in terms of time, I think we have about 11 minutes, right, till the top of the hour. So maybe we just do a end there and do a debrief, like kind of a round of how it. I kind of feel, I don't know if it's how you're doing, Mark, is like a lot more to say. But I could say a lot more, but just in terms of the commitment to time. So I guess I'll start that I really enjoyed this. It's very satisfying to me to be. I've been focusing on the empathy circle as a practice, and really wanting to develop it and kind of get more insight. So to be specifically talking about the empathy circle as a practice, and everyone's experience with it, I just found it very helpful, very beneficial, and just harvesting all these insights. So I quite enjoyed this. And I have a lot more. I think I could probably go another hour to kind of express, all the stuff that I'd like to express. So I don't know if either of you have kind of feedback or comments the last 9 minutes here.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed these experiences too. And I think everything that you all, because you've had so many more experience of doing this. So, and the confidence you two have, because you've seen things happen. So it's one thing to say, have this habit, and you should try this. Another thing to say that you should try this habit, because I've seen an experience, and maybe you want to try it out, and it will be useful. It's definitely useful. It's incredibly useful, and it's necessary for democracy as a way of life. It's absolutely necessary in every relationship to destroy or limit the power dynamics in play. I think the one thing too is like it's the necessary part of the structure, as Lou and Edwin you've been saying, it's necessary part of the structure to help formulate the habit. And then when you're outside of the structure, to be able to use the habit or to practice the habit in certain ways is always going to require a judgment of when it needs to be. inexperience, the messiness of experience. But you can't ever have that opportunity unless you have the structure that's going to inform the habit, or have one be able to experience it. Everything comes out of experience. We experience the world. And again, I think sometimes the sensing that I've had is, initially it feels a little strange because it's not the normal process. So it sort of tweaks the brain a little bit. Well, let's try to see it this way or try to do this. And I think that's important for changing habits. And so I think, again, that's the only thing is this, when you building the skill and then thinking about how to use it, for whose purpose, for what end, for whose interest, right, in a democratic open society, if one chooses to do that.
Thanks, Mark. So this has been fun. It's been fun reflecting on what I've learned about empathy and empathy circles and the power of the structure of it. I really enjoyed meeting Mark and hearing from you, hearing your thoughts and insights about it. I think, what else do I think? I think, it's interesting what you were saying about taking it out into the world. So I definitely do take this out into the world. And, actually the way that I find that it's the sweetest is that just by listening to someone for a minute, like in the grocery, the person at the checkout counter, or the person who's come to my house to work, on a thing. If I spend a minute with them talking and I let them know that they are seen and understood, I reflect back a little bit what I'm hearing from them. It's amazing how that can create connection or transform a moment where there's some difficulty happening. Two people are misunderstanding each other, or there's some little conflict, and just by reflecting what's happening, that it can shift the dynamic. So I definitely think that skill of being oriented towards trying to understand seeing a person and seeing what they're trying to say or what is important to them in that moment, seeing that and naming it, as opposed to looking at the world through the lens of, is what's going on here right or wrong? Do I agree with it or disagree? Is this person being to this or to that or whatever? Evaluating the rightness or the wrongness of what's happening, rather than just seeing the desire that's happening and reflecting that, naming that. I have put little bits of transformation out into the world by doing that, and I encourage others to do that too, and not to think of, well, this is really only something you can do when you're in the circle and you've got the structure of the circle happening, so.
Yeah. Well, this is, I'm hoping this was the first circle which is sort of self-referential in terms of, let's look at what the nature of the circle is. So I wanted to do this with the other many authors of empathy books and, who are working in the field. So this was the first kind of that practice of what is your experience of the empathy circle? And for me, it seemed to work. I'm going to try to transcribe this as much as I can, and see if I can write up something, kind of harvest the material and write it up. So I guess are any comments about that?
There is software on the internet where you could submit the audio of the session and it would transcribe it for you, with pretty good accuracy, not perfect, but, see. If you're really wanting to transcribe the conversation, you could do that.
Yeah, YouTube has it. It does like an automatic. It's not the most accurate, but
yeah, there are other straight transcription services that you could submit it to.
Okay. Oh, great. Well, okay. Well, thank you so much for taking part in this, and I'm going to be holding more of them. You're welcome to take part in more circles with other people. They're going to try to mix and match, variety of people. It was interesting to do 3 people. I was kind of curious how that worked. It seemed to work, but we'll see. Then I'll do another one with 4 and kind of compare that. So thanks again for taking part, and